Greetings, everybody. I want to start by acknowledging that we here at the UBC Vancouver campus are gathered today on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam people. Saying this helps situate us and grounds us in the local. It is a reminder of the obligations that I think we all have to those who have been stewarding this land. And those obligations are ours, whether our families can trace back generations here in Vancouver, or whether we have just come to Vancouver recently, as in my case. Recognizing the Musqueam and also the coastal Salish peoples as an obligation and an invitation to think more widely about the intersections of migration in particular and colonialism. And this is as relevant to Vancouver and Canada as it is to a country that we'll be hearing more about today, Australia. And this talk that we're going to hear today is our very first one in the 2025 academic year's speaker series at the Center for Migration Studies. And our theme this year is understanding liminality and legal precarity. And I'll have to say that we chose this theme in part for reasons that are really situated in Canadian politics. As many of you know, Canadian immigration policy has changed in the last year, 2 years, in such a way that it is harder for people to become permanent residents. And also here in North America, given the draconian enforcement actions happening in the United States, this theme of liminality and legal precarity might become more and more important, whether locally or across the continent. As many people here know, being a migrant often involves a feeling of not quite being here or there, whether you're settled or you're insecure. And this feeling of liminality, of that in-betweenness, affects many migrants' everyday lives. Now, this can be made much worse by legal systems. And so not only do you feel culturally, socially in between, but legally, whether you're living in a refugee camp, you're holding a temporary visa, you are trying to adjust your status, you face this precarity. And it's one that is faced especially by those who are undocumented or have temporary status in a country. And so the speaker series this year really wants to highlight that legal precarity and liminality, but also acknowledge that it intersects with other forms of inequality, be it based on race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, disability, etc. And so you're going to see that the speakers over the course of this academic year are going to be grappling with that sense of liminality, legal and otherwise, and what it means for migration studies. But at the same time, and I really want to underscore this, we also want to highlight the resilience, the creativity, and the strengths of migrants as they face these challenges. And so we both want to acknowledge the vulnerabilities and the challenges, but also call out in terms of the resistance and the actions that are taken in the face of that. My name is Irene Blumrad. I'm a professor in the departments of political science and sociology, and it is also my great honor to be one of the co-directors at the Center for Migration Studies. My other co-director this year is Suzanne Huot, who is right here. Let's welcome Suzanne, please. I personally want to thank Suzanne for taking on the job of being a co-director at the Center for Migration Studies. I'll have to tell you, after 1 year of being at CMS, it is incredibly exciting, but it is also incredibly, let's just say, never stopping. There is so many exciting things happening at the center and in so many different areas and initiatives. So here you're at one of our public events. We have the Certificate for Migration Studies. We have all of our research groups. We have Research Day coming up, which is partnership between CMS and community organizations. We have a number of postdocs at our center. We are developing all kinds of other outreach initiatives. We're running grants. We're writing grants. The fun never stops. And so I want to thank Suzanne for helping me oversee some of that fun. Moving right along. In thanking you for coming today, I'm also going to thank those people who might be online. One of the things that COVID has brought us is the ability to do hybrid things such as the speaker series. For those online, I want to remind you that things don't always go as planned. If technology sort of fails us for a brief moment, hang on, we're going to get you back on. And for those online, we'll have a question and answer at the end for everybody. And if you have a question online, you just type in your question on the Q&A function, and then Marie Frileux will be gathering questions and we'll insert the questions from people online during the Q&A. Many of you have come to our CMS events before, but for those of you who are new, our usual way of doing this is that we have our speakers speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we open it up to questions and answers. So if you have a clarifying question during the talk, you can raise your hand and ask it, but we ask you to hold your other questions to the end to let our speaker get through the presentation. And that is a wonderful transition to talk about our speaker. We're very proud at the Center for Migration Studies by the fact that we can bring in some of the best and brightest migration scholars to talk to us here at UBC about cutting edge issues. And then when we were putting together the speaker series this year, I sort of thought to myself, well, we have some pretty bright lights here at UBC, and why do we always have to bring in other people when we actually have cutting edge scholars right here amongst us? And so I'm particularly excited by the fact that our very first speaker for the 25-26 year is going to be our own Helena Zeweri, an assistant professor in anthropology. She was drawn into anthropology because of its capacity to examine how people navigate relations of power in everyday life. And we're going to see that today, I think, in the presentation. Dr. Zeweri completed her doctoral studies in cultural anthropology at Rice University, where, as you're going to probably hear, conducted research on migrant-targeted social welfare policies in Melbourne, Australia. And she observed the everyday work of family violence prevention workers, policymakers, and migrant community leaders. Following her PhD, she spent 2 years as an assistant professor at the University of Virginia's Global Studies program, and then we were lucky enough to attract her to UBC. Here at UBC, she teaches courses on culture, power and politics, diasporic belonging, ethnographies of Australia, and the relationship between empire and migration. I know we have a number of students who are in the Certificate of Migration Studies. Check out Helena's classes. They count to the certificate. And without any further ado, I'm going to ask you to welcome Helena Zeweri to the microphone.
Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Irene. And thank you to Atmaza, Marie, and Maya, and the CMS staff for organizing this event. And thank you to you all for taking time out of your day to be here. I should mention that this talk is based on a working draft of a paper, so I'm very open to your feedback and your thoughts in the Q&A, and I'll try best to keep it to probably closer to 45 minutes, so thank you for your patience with it. Okay, so with that, I'll begin. So for those who arrive to Australia using sea routes, the enduring effects of prolonged legal liminality produced by Australia's deterrence-based border regime shape refugee subjectivity in profound ways. While many studies have examined how deterrence policies physically exclude migrants from entry, threaten carceral punishment, and weaponize temporary legal status to prohibit access to basic rights and resources, less examined have been the lasting effects of deterrence policies on migrants' own senses of personhood. So my talk today examines how former refugees of an Afghan Hazara background conceptualize the effects of protracted temporary status within the broader context of Australia's deterrence-based border regime on their senses of self and place in the world. And so through examining their narratives, I argue that Australia's deterrence-based border policies not only function to deny physical entry to migrants, but also produce a prolonged sense of internalized social dislocation because of how their past temporary status follows them in new ways well after refuge or permanent protection have been granted. Such experiences reveal the embeddedness of protracted temporariness within the spatially and temporally expanding horizons of contemporary deterrence policies. Through taking an ethnographic perspective that centers migrant narratives of their social worlds post-refuge, I hope to show that the effects of deterrence policies are not limited to migrants in transit and do not cease when migrants are granted permanent protection. Examining the lived encounter with deterrence reveals that the prolonged temporary status inflicted by past deterrence policies continue to affect the present-day subjectivities of those with permanent status by making their ability to facilitate family reunification virtually impossible. And so the enduring effects of deterrence-based border policies, laws, government directives, and technological strategies that are designed to prevent migrants' crossing of the border become apparent to me when former refugees talked about themselves as relational subjects who viewed refuge not only as a political status, but also as a feeling of being oriented to the world through one's social relations, with whom one has shared experiences of suffering, joy, and displacement. Despite being legally recognized as refugees, for some, refuge could not be meaningfully experienced due to the ongoing prohibitory effects of prolonged temporary status on family reunification. Let's see. Sorry, just gonna move. Okay. So over the last 2 decades, offshore detention, temporary protection visas, or TPVs, and bridging visas have undergone a cycle of abolition and reactivation by Australia's Labor and Liberal governments, resulting in thousands of boat arrivals being assigned various statuses and uneven pathways to refuge. Such policies have given rise to a class of people who have been living in prolonged legal limbo with limited or no work rights, limited access to social services and support, and the inability to sponsor family members. For a small cohort of Afghan Hazara people who have been able to transition from TPVs and bridging visas to permanent protection visas or have achieved asylum, Australia's deterrence-based border regime continues to affect their senses of personhood because while their legal status has been resolved, it is their social worlds that remain in a state of dislocation and fragmentation. Australia's deterrence-based border regime involves prolonged detention and temporary status, which produces social fragmentation that impacts former refugees' senses of self. What I hope to show in this paper is that my interlocutors view the self as an intersubjective one in 2 ways. First, they view themselves as individuals who exist within a broader social world to which they have ongoing material obligations, as well as shared experiences of joy, pain, sorrow, and hope that bind them together in the struggle for a more viable future. This conception of the self resonates with the anthropological framework of intersubjectivity. According to anthropologist Michael Jackson, intersubjectivity begins with the understanding of the intersubjective self, who is experienced as relational and variable, emerging and negotiated in a, quote, field of interpersonal relations as a mode of being in the world, end quote. Intersubjectivity captures the sentiment that one's aspirations for oneself cannot be fully formed and realized without those persons with whom one has long established relations of care and shared experiences of struggle and future making. Intersubjectivity as a framework thus attends to how human interaction involves what Jackson calls contending needs that are forever being adjusted one to the other. Deterrence-based border regimes attempt to prevent migrants who take irregular routes from entering the nation state. Deterrence policies, however, do not work with an a priori conception of irregular routes. Rather, such policies actively produce particular routes as irregular and particular modes of entry as illegal through modifying migration laws, militarizing select ports of entry such that migrants are forced to reroute their journeys, and expanding executive-level discretions around determining the legitimacy of certain modes of entry. For example, in September 2001, the Australian government passed several amendments to the Migration Act of 1958, which reflects what border criminology scholar Peter Chambers has called deterrence's constructive and creative practice of sovereignty making. Australian territory that no longer counted as a legitimate area of arrival for the purposes of claiming asylum, the migration excision zone was created. And that's reflected in the top yellow portion in the image at the top right. Another amendment declared that, quote, offshore entry persons, end quote, could be taken to declared countries, including Nauru and Papua New Guinea, where they would be held in detention centers indefinitely as their asylum claims were reviewed, or they could be removed to a third country. Another amendment also expanded the powers of detention centers to punish certain kinds of behavior on the part of asylum seekers through Australia's criminal code, so bringing together immigration law and criminal law. Those who arrived by boat, who were eventually admitted into the mainland, were put on temporary protection or bridging visas, some for up to 10 years, which denied them access to basic services and education and prevented them from visiting family or sponsoring family members through the humanitarian visa stream, which is the more official stream through which humanitarian asylum seekers gain entry into Australia. Australia has taken a distinct approach to deterrence compared to its global counterparts that, while following the global trend toward the externalization of border control, deploys one of the most expansive and preemptive infrastructures around stopping migration via sea routes. Australia has been one of the first countries to focus its deterrence efforts as far back as migrants' origin countries through deploying a range of media campaigns buttressed by sophisticated research projects that aim to understand the psychology of prospective migrants and intervene into their decision-making. Similar to the US's 1994 policy of prevention through deterrence, which produced increasingly lethal alternative routes for migrants seeking entry, the Migration Excision Zone Amendment also eliminated legal ports of entry across Australia's maritime border. However, distinct from prevention through deterrence, Australia's policies do not intend for migrants to reroute their journeys to more dangerous entry points, leaving them to their own devices to survive or perish. Rather, Australia's deterrence policies explicitly eject migrants who take sea routes from entering the mainland through boat turnbacks, or make it so difficult and undesirable by threatening carceral punishment. Such policies have also deployed the threat of offshore penal punishment through detaining asylum seekers within detention centers in Manus and the island of Nauru. For those who have managed to make it in as a result of temporary shifts in government policy or ministerial decisions, which resulted in their transference to the mainland, they encounter a set of prohibitive laws and policies that foster legal precarity and inhibit a pathway to permanent protection. For example, the government introduced visa categories that place this group in a state of prolonged legal limbo with limited to no work rights, which it hoped would result in their voluntary return. And so Australia's externalized infrastructure, combined with its internal mechanisms, which prolong temporariness, constitute deterrence as what Sandberg calls, quote, a set of policies intended to influence future behavior by creating obstacles to cross-border mobility and by eroding the quality of protection for those who are already present, end quote. And so Australia's approach to deterrence functions as a form of governmentality that aims to not only inhibit physical immobility, but to also discipline migrant decision-making. Ultimately, its goal is for prospective migrants to convince themselves that it is too risky to migrate. And I'm currently working on a paper on the role of public information campaigns as a tool of psychological violence in this regard. And so Leanne Weber and Sharon Pickering, also scholars of border criminologies, have argued that Australia increasingly uses a preemptive approach to deterrence, known as what they call neoliberal deterrence, in that it focuses on communicating risk and producing what the state would brand as voluntary compliance on the part of prospective migrants, rather than solely doling out punishment in response to irregular migration. Okay. Oops. Sorry. Okay. And so studies of deterrence-based border policies in the global north have tended to focus on the extraterritorial dimensions and the territorially expansive border enforcement infrastructure. Unmanned aerial vehicles, radars, antenna, and satellite technology are increasingly being used to detect migrant movement further out into the seas. Global North countries have also turned to remote and hard-to-reach sites to establish carceral regimes, where asylum seekers are held as their claims are reviewed, thus enacting state sovereignty through a framework of criminalization and carcerality. As I mentioned, public information campaigns are also key technologies of these enforcement infrastructures, in that they attempt to dissuade prospective migrants from arriving to Australia's shores through weaponizing guilt and shame. And I have included visuals of such campaigns here. The image at the top left is written in Farsi, and at the top it says Hargiz, which means never, and it is a rough kind of mirroring of the campaign at the bottom, which says, no way, you will not make Australia home. The images on the right are from a graphic novel that was circulated to prospective Afghan Hazara migrants and was circulated throughout refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran, and even in migrants' origin villages in Afghanistan. And this was produced by the Department of Home Affairs in Australia. The images are meant to evoke feelings of shame and guilt. They are trying to tell prospective migrants about the futility of migrating to Australia, because if they do so, they will face prolonged detention, disease, among other things. What is particularly striking is the image in the circle, which shows the cultural disconnection that Afghan Hazara migrants will face because they will be separated from their family members for long periods of time. Such campaigns, alongside other mechanisms of deterrence, however, have primarily been examined in the scholarship in terms of their effects on migrant mobility across borders through physical and bureaucratic barriers and psychological manipulation. As a result, the way that these deterrence-based strategies continue to affect those who have achieved some kind of permanent protection and who have ostensibly escaped the legal and disciplinary regimes of deterrence have been less examined. And so what I want to do in this talk is to think about and show how deterrence continues to affect the lives and social worlds of those who have reached their destination and are no longer the formal target audience of the aforementioned mechanisms. I hope to attend to how deterrence operates at the level of subjectivity and personhood, thereby loosening the analytical grip of the policy-centric temporalities of admission and refuge on deterrence. Former refugees who view the self as relational do not view their own refuge and admission as marking the end of their experience with deterrence regimes. Their past prolonged liminality continues to affect their lives through immobilizing those whom they care about deeply and who make them who they are. So, as scholars of the political and cultural struggles of the Afghan Hazara diaspora, Farkhunde Akbari and Kobra Muradi have recently written, one must take an intersectional understanding of systematic oppression in Hazara communities, attending to the role of gender, ethno-racial, and religious identities and geographical location. Aidan Parks is another scholar who has written in an ethnographic study of Afghan Hazara refugees' experiences of migration, relocation, and self-discovery in Australia that individual experiences of displacement and socialization are deeply varied and don't reflect any kind of essentialized or intrinsic identity. That systematic discrimination and marginalization of ethno-racial minorities has been central to the founding of the Afghan nation state, as laid out by Niamatullah Ibrahimi. And so I'm giving you a little bit of background as to the kinds of systematic issues that Afghan Hazaras have faced in Afghanistan, which has very much shaped their experiences of displacement. So the centralized Afghan nation state left behind by Abdurrahman Khan in 1901 relied on what Ibrahimi calls the manipulation of sociocultural differences and the reinstatement of ethnic hierarchies as a precursor for security, ultimately reproducing the supremacy of Pashtun social, political, and religious systems in place of a more pluralist approach. It was not only people who were killed, but cultural traditions and social structures, and deep histories and forms of knowledge. This also resulted in systematic restrictions of religious life and forced conversions to Sunni Islam within the Hazara community. And so Afghan Hazara people's motivations to flee Afghanistan have emerged from intensified persecution by para-state and insurgent actors, including attacks at religious shrines and gatherings, Taliban kidnappings, and ethno-racialized violence, which have at times intersected with gender-based violence. For those refugees whom Farnaz Shahimi and her colleagues Eva Alisic interviewed, the desire to flee and build a new community in Australia is rooted in a consciousness that one belongs to a group that has faced historical, ethnic, and racial persecution for centuries. And so the history of state-sanctioned persecution in Afghanistan and multi-generational displacement as a result of ongoing civil and imperial-led wars has produced a community that views its mobilities and well-being as interconnected, as a scholar of Afghan displacement, Melissa Chiovenda, talks about. So interconnected across global geographies. And so a bit about my methods. This study is based on the oral histories and life narratives of former Afghan Hazara refugees who now live in Australia. It attends to not only how they narrate their suffering, but also how they themselves explain the social effects of deterrence-based border regimes. In doing so, it tries to take seriously their explanations, not only as testimonies of suffering, but also as epistemologies in their own right of border violence. It combines discursive analysis with qualitative observations to produce grounded theory. It takes up Sandberg, Schultz, and Cole's call to center ethnographic perspectives on deterrence. And so the talk is based on 30 semi-structured interviews I conducted primarily in Melbourne in the state of Victoria, with a select few interviews done virtually over the course of 2016 to 2017 and 2023 to 2024. Written consent was obtained by all interviewees through a consent form. Human ethics research approval was granted for the different time periods of the project. I've also changed the names of all of my interlocutors in this talk to protect their identities. During the periods mentioned, I attended several public events and that were advocating for the end to Australia's Stop the Boats policies and observed the broader movement to end offshore and onshore detention. Most of the people I interviewed migrated to Australia somewhere between 1999 and 2013. Because many migrated before July 9th, 2013, which is when the government began a new policy that said anyone who attempts to reach the Australian mainland by boat will unequivocally face detention in an offshore detention center and will never be resettled on the mainland. So that happened July 9th, 2013. But many of the people I interviewed migrated before then. They had differing experiences of the government's policy of offshore detention because prior to 2013, it was a little bit up and down in terms of whether or not offshore detention was mandatory. So those who came before this date did not unequivocally get detained since it wasn't mandatory between 2008 and 2013. However, many came by boat and did experience onshore detention. All experienced some form of prolonged temporary status, and none came through state-sponsored refugee resettlement schemes. And so in this talk, I conduct an up-close analysis of three narratives, but I try to situate them within broader patterns observed across other interviews. Okay. So I'll begin with Jawed. Jawad's experience of Australia's deterrence-based border regime reflects the enduring effects of temporary status on family reunification and migrants' sense of personhood. Jawed had been detained in an onshore detention center in Sydney for several months after arriving to Australia by boat via Indonesia as a young adult. For the last 12 years, Jawed had been on a temporary protection visa, which offers limited work and educational rights. He had volunteered for several years as an advocate on behalf of other recently arrived Hazara refugees through an NGO that aimed to abolish TPVs and replace them with permanent protection visas. He had only recently been granted permanent protection, or what is known as resolution of status for those who were on TPVs. This was a relief, but introduced new social obstacles. I asked Jawed what he felt was missing in prevailing narratives around Australia's immigration policies. He replied, quote, "We tend to focus on the individual refugee. Deterrence policies affect the entire family, the entire community, even Afghanistan itself," end quote. Jawad's insights rethink deterrence, especially as it relates to refugees whose family members live in zones of ongoing political instability and material insecurity, such as Afghanistan. Jawed went on to discuss the bureaucratic and administrative difficulties that asylum seekers faced in sponsoring their family members due to the fact that they were constantly being subject to prolonged temporary status or at risk of being illegalized after being given a temporary or bridging visa. The threat of being returned to temporary protracted status was ultimately tied to the expansion of discretionary ministerial power in Australia, in this case, the Minister of Immigration, which is a key operative mechanism of Australia's internal deterrence infrastructure. And Ayelet Sachar also describes this in her book, The Shifting Border. In 2007, ministerial discretionary power had dramatically expanded, allowing the minister to exercise authority to re-detain asylum seekers without warning, to send asylum seekers on the mainland to offshore detention centers, and to prevent review of claims for protection visas. So Jawad's comments on the discretionary power of deterrence-based policies evokes Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, defined as, quote, incremental, accretive, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales, end quote. And this resonates with the temporally expansive effects of deterrence in Jawad's narrative. Deterrence deploys discretionary power to produce long-lasting transnational effects designed to nullify people's aspirations for family reunification by keeping them in a state of temporary legality over long periods of times. And this status produced limited work rights, which reduced the capacity for Jawed to send financial support to his family members, but even more importantly, slotted him and other TPV holders into different legal categories for the purposes of family sponsorship. So I'll get into that now. So due to a shift in policy in February 2023, which abolished temporary protection visas, Jawed, as I mentioned before, was granted permanent protection or resolution of status, which does allow one to sponsor family members. However, by the time this status was granted to Jawed, it was almost impossible to lodge family sponsorship applications, especially for those like him who were part of the legacy caseload of refugees. So this term refers to a group of refugees who arrived by boat to Australia at various points in 2012 and 2013. They were not subject to transfer to Nauru or PNG and instead lodged visa applications on the mainland. In December 2014, a change in law meant that people like Jawed could no longer apply for a permanent protection visa, but could only keep renewing their TPVs. Furthermore, the 2014 law stated that because this group of people did not enter Australia through the special humanitarian visa stream, even if they were to get permanent protection, they were hereby barred from sponsoring family members through this program. Instead, they had to use the family migration program. So the way that you enter informs and affects what stream you can use to sponsor family members in the future. So we had to use the family migration program because of the way that he entered. This is an important distinction because the humanitarian visa program has a broader definition of family, which doesn't require as much proof to demonstrate evidence of family relationships. For example, the family migration stream defines someone over the age of 23 as not a dependent, making it hard for asylum seekers to sponsor their children who were legally dependents when they left for Australia, but who have now aged out of dependent status. In addition to its more restrictive definition of family, the family migration stream also has higher visa fees. So partner visa application charges, including children, can cost more than 20,000 Australian dollars. And it poses documentation barriers. So for people who find it difficult to find passports and identity papers, it's really hard. Applicants also face technical issues with online applications and have to deal with repeating health checks that expire quickly. So these narrow definitions that reproduce the hegemony of the nuclear family to some extent, coupled with bureaucratic backlogs and no alternative pathways, ultimately inhibit the possibility of family reunification, even for those with permanent protection, because their past prolonged temporary status haunts what they can do now. Encounters with various parts of this border regime produce assessments of deterrence as a form of slow violence that haunts the prospects for reunification. This prolonged immobility steals refugees' time, as Shahram Khosravi has written, which makes it difficult for migrants to project themselves forward in time. And this inability to project themselves is shaped by a sense of self that is intersubjective and tied to the mobility of others. So Jawed described the experience as deeply dislocating and characterized it as a kind of collective trauma that he and others he advocated for felt as they witnessed the ongoing attacks in densely populated Hazara villages and religious gatherings while being in Australia. Here, Jawed's narrative invites a critical reappraisal of the spectacle of border exclusion, to use Nicholas DeGenova's phrasing. DeGenova and others have called for a reorientation to the interiorization of border control. So to think about sites of labor exploitation of undocumented workers, what he calls the obscene of inclusion, and to look at the deputization of local police who act as immigration enforcement, and the embeddedness of these enforcement regimes in social services and care-based institutions. But I think Jawed's story also points to the ways in which border control continues to function outside of even these formal infrastructures, how it functions in the background as a kind of loud humming that represses the possibilities for restoring the self. I also read in Jawade's story and those of others whom I interviewed, like Firishta, who spent her whole adolescence in New South Wales on a temporary work visa, separated from her father for years, who was detained in an onshore detention center in Northern Australia, the cumulative effects of past prolonged temporary status. So how does time spent in a temporary state affect those who remain behind in sites of ongoing political instability, but also those whose family members are detained in the mainland, Australia? And so another person I spoke with was Osman. Osman was a refugee rights advocate I met in Melbourne who had been working for the past few years for an advocacy organization. Osman herself had been dealing with significant social isolation since arriving to Australia in 2010 from Kabul. She had left Afghanistan due to systemic marginalization by her work colleagues and her family. She described feeling dismissed at her job in the civil society sector and to feeling as though her aspirations were trivialized within her family. Osman arrived to Tasmania through a scholarship program for Afghan women. Pregnant with her second child, Osman decided to apply for asylum a few months after giving birth and went on a bridging visa with both of her children. A bridging visa is a transitional visa for people who are in the process of adjusting legal status. The bridging visa, however, prohibits employment within Australia and travel outside of Australia. Upon giving birth, despite the fact that her application was in the pipeline and her status issues were almost resolved, Osman began to realize how socially disconnected she felt from her community back home. She noted, "I gave birth here and I had no one. It was so weird to admit yourself into the hospital when you are closer to your due date. That hit me hard. Even the people I never liked in my life and who were there when I gave birth to my first child. Loneliness here is deep, really scary. It can be really dangerous. It's very different to what you have felt back home. Even the pain of violence. Me and my neighbor are counseling each other, so back home. Here, you can't find that common ground. It's hard to find the right person to talk to. I have found loneliness here scarier than back home. When they ask you for your emergency contact, you realize you have no one. Then you have to call a random person when you are new. Can you be my emergency contact? Back home, everyone is an emergency contact." After giving birth, Osman had to wait several years for her asylum claim to be reviewed because of the backlog in applications. Coinciding with Australia's Stop the Boats policies were onshore policies that kept people on bridging visas in a holding period, further pushing them into a lengthy bureaucratic backlog that fostered their legal liminality. Osman experienced this institutional backlog as an erasure of personhood. This erasure stemmed not only from not having been granted permanent protection, but also from being disconnected from the people she cared about most due to her prolonged temporary status. Osman described the experience of waiting for her asylum decision as one of self-fragmentation. She noted, quote, "I mean, half of us are here, but then mentally you are stuck there as well. You know, it's not that you are here and you call it home. No, your home is falling apart, and it's a little bit everywhere that you are just trying to collect." End quote. Waiting in this case is also an act of witnessing from afar the ongoing brutalities of war and violence and how they affect one's loved ones. In 2013, for example, insurgent attacks against Hazara mosques and social gatherings intensified in Afghanistan, further intensifying Osman's sense of loneliness. For Osman, self-fragmentation was not only experienced through loneliness, but also through absorbing the reality that she could not allow herself to anticipate any meaningful form of reunification while witnessing the uncertainties her loved ones had to endure from afar. And this kind of speaks to this concept of anticipatory loss. And so, as Shahram Khosravi writes, waiting by migrants involves different geographies, other people, and different phases of life. Thus, waiting is never an individual action. The consequences of prolonged waiting affect not only the individual migrant, but the many people around her who remain in a state of waiting for material and non-material remittances or for reunification. End quote. Osman went on to describe this sense of perpetual waiting to be reunited as though she were disappearing, and this was a word that she used. Osman expressed that at times she felt her entire self was disappearing, because for her, the self is only whole when it can share grief, loss, and joy with others in moments of both uncertainty and hope. Osman's narrative reflects the idea of legal liminality, but in a way slightly different from Cecilia Menjivar's conception. For Menjivar, legal liminality brings together Victor Turner's conception of liminality, which captures this transitional period between two stable conditions. And it brings it together with Susan Coutine's notion of legal non-existence, which is marked by being socially active but not having legal recognition. In Osman and others' cases, feeling like one is in a transitional state does not always correspond to a lack of legal recognition, but rather is marked by a sense of uncertainty around one's ability to meaningfully live life now that legal recognition has been granted. So while Osman had been granted asylum, she lacked the ability to restore social relations, again, because of her past prolonged temporary status. This feeling reemerged for Osman following the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021 and the mass displacement produced in the wake of the international community's withdrawal from the country. Osman's siblings sought to escape, but facilitating their journey proved challenging. Her siblings could not find a way to Kabul airport, the only way out of the country, during the month of August. Given that hundreds of thousands of people were making their way there, Osman's siblings felt it was too risky and their children's lives would be at risk. This was compounded by the fact that they had to confront Taliban checkpoints throughout the country, which were particularly grave for Afghan Hazaras, already vulnerable due to their ethno-racial background. Compounding these challenges, since 2013, visa applications made from outside Australia by family members of those in Australia with protection visas who arrived by boat or who had bridging visas were categorized as low priority. As a result, many families were kept separated and could not reunite until the sponsor actually obtained Australian citizenship. So such applications remain in backlog because of a cap the Department of Immigration and Border Protection places on the number of family visas granted annually. While Osman did not attempt to sponsor her family members while on a bridging visa, she did not feel that her being granted asylum put her in a better position to sponsor them in 2021 because too much time had gone by for her siblings to even viably escape the country through a sponsorship. And so I'm toggling back and forth between what's going on in Afghanistan and what's happening with the immigration policies and laws in Australia to show you that they work together, they're interconnected, they're not isolated from each other. And that's why this group's experiences are such a interesting window into how deterrence continues to have effects, even though formally it has stopped. Political developments back home could not keep up with the passage of time lost waiting for Osman to get legal status. Osman felt as though she had lost her chance. Additionally, for her family members, navigating via irregular routes could slow down rather than speed up the process. However, it's important to note that Osman's work as a refugee advocate has had a significant impact on her own sense of value, making her feel, as she noted in our interview, reappeared, and that's the word that she used. Osman felt that she was helping others reappear through advancing the casework of other refugees who were also in legally precarious situations, and which could in turn help them anticipate the restoration of social relations and to use their stories to advocate for policy reform. And so Osman said, and personally for myself, it's my personal experience. It's the experience of my friends and family members. It's people who I see suffer because of these policies on a daily basis. It's not just a political agenda and, this big thing in the parliament, but it starts from someone waking up in the morning and not knowing what their day is going to look like because they may not have work rights, they may not have study rights, they don't have any documentation, they don't have any recognition, they don't have any identity, basically. So there is no one in this place. And then we know people who have been in this state for 5, 6 to 10 or over years. So for me, it's about seeing the practical sides of these policies and the impact of those policies in the daily lives of human beings. It's about leading my own path and trying to help others to find their own journey of appearing, end quote. And so Osman's sentiments were echoed by several other refugees I interviewed who went on to become advocates. Such advocates saw their work as a way to restore their sense of purpose because it connected them to people with shared experiences and allowed them to help others facilitate reunification with their families. Osman's own experience shaped her belief that legal recognition and material stability had to go hand in hand with strengthening people's social relations, because such relations were key to overcoming everyday challenges. And so she noted, describing everyday life in her hometown in Afghanistan, quote, when you go in the street, you suddenly run into someone and you talk to them about things that are frustrating you. It's beautiful in that sense, that social trust and connection and local counseling is so valuable and deep. It does cure you. It does help you. Even the pain of violence, me and my neighbor are counseling each other. Here, you can't find that common ground. It's hard to find the right person to talk to. Here, you have to pay a service to talk to someone, even with culturally appropriate services. They don't get there. They don't remedy the wound, but your neighbor back home next door hits the spot. And so for Osman, being able to reunify with those with whom one has shared deep memories and experiences was key to relocating oneself within a foreign environment. And so advocacy allowed her and others to reappear and recreate sociality after feeling disappeared by the cumulative social fragmentation brought on by Australia's temporary status regime. So Osman noted, "Az zang zar me sazim," which in Farsi means "we make rust shine." Osman said, quote, we don't leave it as rust to rot and become something painful. We make it shine. This is that process. The advocacy is more of that. It's the process of making suffering shine. Put some light on others as well if you can, end quote. Oh, sorry, I forgot to go to the slide when I was talking about Osman, but I read these quotes out loud, so you can have a look there. And so the last vignette I'll share is about Ali. Ali is in his 30s and lives in regional Victoria. He grew up in a rural province of Afghanistan and at a young age was forced to be the primary financial provider for his family, confronting ongoing racial and ethnic discrimination. He migrated to Kabul but could not find work. At age 17, he decided to leave for Iran, but was immediately deported back to Afghanistan. Ali left again after a while in the hopes of making it to Australia through multiple points of transit, including Pakistan, Malaysia, Oman, Indonesia, and eventually he made it to Christmas Island, where for a while Australia had an operative detention center. Ali noted, quote, so it has been a very tough, long journey at that age. We made it, fortunately. So many Afghans drowned in the sea. I have seen horrible things, to be honest, how Afghans are treated especially. Smugglers treat Afghans like absolute rubbish. You have to get into a trunk of a vehicle, you have to walk through mountains, and then you have to be smart to get yourself out of airports. Very challenging. Then we come here. We went to school here in Australia. Now I'm at university. It has been a long journey, end quote. When Ali did eventually make it to Indonesia, he embarked on a boat to Australia. Ali's boat was stopped at Christmas Island, where he was detained for several months. Ali's insights, while focused less directly on the effects of temporary status, offer an articulation of deterrence as an intersubjective form of violence. Ali had developed, and I'll get into that part now. Ali had developed a keen understanding of how Australia's deterrence policies worked. Upon being transferred to Australia, he was put on a temporary visa, but his family members remained back in his home village, making it difficult for him to feel a genuine sense of belonging and place. Shortly after Ali's arrival, the government, under former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, adopted Operation Sovereign Borders, a military-led response to boat arrivals, which involved boat turnbacks, equipping source and transit countries with the capacity to intercept asylum seekers, increasing the capacity of offshore detention centers, and denying boat arrivals resettlement in Australia, reintroducing TPVs for asylum seekers in Australia who were awaiting determination of refugee status, and denying refugee status for those who were believed to have discarded their identity documents, which many migrants who come by boat do when they're about to reach a detention center or naval vessel. In other words, Ali's arrival coincided with the realization that he may never be reunited with his family members. In other words, removal from the carceral regime produced a new sense of stuckness brought on by the anticipation of perpetual disconnection. And so the policies adopted by the Abbott government had a deep impact on prospective reunification pathways that many other, primarily male refugees who did make it to the mainland had been anticipating as they attempted to establish new lives for their partners and children from whom they had already been separated for years. And so this sense of foregone disconnection shaped Ali's understanding of how deterrence worked as a logic of violence. He said, quote, "They're trying to deter people, slow visa processes and everything else, so people don't come. That's their policy, deterring and catching people. Someone is waiting for 10 years and separated from their village. Of course, they're going to be in a bad situation and complain. Those with close relatives in Afghanistan connected with that person, they will hear his stories and challenges, and then they will not head to Australia. That's what they're trying to do," end quote. Ali's use of the word catching refers not only to boat turnbacks or interceptions, but also to the broader ways in which this deterrence policy makes prospective migrants feel stuck aside from their physical incarceration. Rather, to catch is also to inhibit the mobilities of the asylum seekers' family members and to fragment their social world. For Ali, deterrence was not only about catching people physically, but also about catching and containing their desires. It was designed to prevent whole communities from leaving Afghanistan and took on a disciplinary and punitive function. And both Ali and Jawed analogized the government's logic to that of the Taliban, which I thought was very interesting in the sense that they said the Taliban pits family members against each other and essentially uses harm against one's family as a threat to the individual, to get the individual to follow their rules and laws. And they felt that a similar logic was operating in the government's approach to deterrence, which I found very thought-provoking. And so I'll just conclude by saying a few words. So by taking intersubjectivity seriously, I hope to think more about the temporality of deterrence-based border regimes and to think about how we might extend that temporality. Intersubjectivity allows for a shift in focus toward the narratives of those who are no longer actively in the process of crossing international borders, and they, for the most part, have the question of their legal status resolved, but they remain stuck in another kind of limbo that revolves around the future of their social connections. Intersubjectivity is a useful framework to understand how what Jackson calls an orientation to the world is interrupted when the possibility of facilitating family reunification becomes less of a reality. And this is what Garcia Martinez Rosas and others have called anticipatory loss through the stealing and chronic devaluation of migrants' time. And so the interviewee's insights for me reveal that the experience of border violence is also shaped by how migrants assign meaning to personhood and by extension, safety and refuge. And I think their insights prompt deeper reflection on the circulated idea that refugees just seek a better life. Well, what does a better life mean for those whose conceptions of the future are interconnected with those with whom they share these deep life histories? So if the future is imaginable through relations with others, how can we expand the political imaginaries that exist around refuge? Can a politics of refuge consider what happens to people's social worlds after desired forms of mobility have been achieved? In a world where securitized borders persist and they intersect with the violence of authoritarian regimes and imperial wars whose effects are ongoing. And so to address these questions, I think it's worth attending to how refugees themselves think about interconnectedness and the lack thereof that unfolds in the aftermath of legal recognition. And so these images here on the left is the cover of a graphic novel by Safdar Ahmed, who himself was a refugee of an Hazara background who was detained in Australia. And in this graphic novel called Still Alive, he focuses a lot on how interconnectedness and social relations were key to survival in the detention center. And also, what ends up happening is people reunite with old family members and friends in the detention center. And so it becomes a space of reunification, but in a very different way. And then to the right is a illustration by Shakila Haidar, an Hazara artist. It's part of a series called Cartographic Struggles, and it examines how, for those who face persistent displacement, home is not defined through geography, but through social relations. That's how she describes this piece, which is called The Map is Elsewhere. And so there are people who are trying to reimagine what refuge means through art and advocacy. And so thank you so much for your patience and time. And yeah, thanks.
All right, well, thank you, Helena. You can see why Helena was the perfect person to launch our series this year on liminality and legal precarity, going beyond the law, but also thinking about the social, the in-between, and the long-term consequences over time and over social relations. We are now going to open the floor for Q&A. We are going to follow our usual procedure, which is going to be 2 questions from in the room for those of you who are able to come to us today in person. And then depending on our Zoom room, we'll take 1 question from the e-world, the outside world beyond this room. When you have a question, just please put up your hand. We have a traveling microphone. And then if you could also just introduce yourself, that would be really useful. I see a hand way in the back.
Hi. Can you hear me? Amazing. My name is Lennon, and I'm based in the Department of Anthropology. I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much. I'm not going to do it's more of a comment than a question. It is a question. And I found a lot of resonance in what you were sharing with some of the work that I am thinking through myself. I did wonder if you, in your interviews and conversations, got a sense of how some of the people you were talking to reconcile the dissonance and contradiction of searching for safety and sanctuary in this same space that produces these affective and relational forms of bordering. So the place that you're going to is the place that also does these things to you. So I wanted in your conversations whether that there was that sort of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lennon, for your question. I think that's an extremely important point. I can recall from my conversation with Ali, there was almost a sense of resignation in his insights, a sense that at this point, I've experienced so many obstacles and barriers that there really is no final telos to this. I got that sense from another person whom I'm working on a different paper, but I call him Rahim. But this sense that, you know, the Australian dream, if you were to call it that, kind of analogous to the American dream, right, doesn't really exist anymore. But it no longer really is about searching for safety. I think it's more, for many of the people I interviewed, about how do you make a viable, meaningful life out of kind of the ruins of this whole experience. And for some who now can, like for Rahim, for example, whom I just mentioned, he went back to Afghanistan in 2017 to visit family, but also people in his village, because he was also trying to figure out, like, what could he do now that he was in this kind of privileged position as a refugee, a resettled refugee in Australia? What could he do to facilitate their mobility or to make their lives better? And so there was this sense that, yes, I'm here in Australia, but that doesn't mean that my investment in a better future for Afghanistan is now no longer a priority. And yeah, it was a sense that it's not a teleological kind of journey. Yeah, but I really like your question, and I want to think about that more. Thank you.
Here in the front.
Thank you. Hello, ma'am. My name is Dr. Neerja Singh. I'm a psychologist. The two things that hit me was that you talked about collective trauma and identity loss. I'm working on a research on moral trauma in refugees and identity loss. The least that could happen to the refugees from the Afghan Hazara community is to provide them with grief counseling, trauma counseling. If you cannot provide them with work and they are going through a massive loss in their lives, this will, in a larger way, prevent psychological violence, which you're going to be talking about in your next paper. And how do you see moral or ethical dilemmas affecting the Afghan Hazara refugees, social integration, and identity loss? How would you perceive that after Asman speaking so vulnerably about herself? From my perspective, it's depression, it's anxiety, it's loss of one's identity. Most of them, I mean, even refugees in Canada, I've come from India to Canada, and a province called Jammu and Kashmir was one place where displaced Hindus by the Muslims, and it was a terror attack on them. I have seen intergenerational trauma, which we would want to even see in these refugees in Australia. So don't you think they should look at an angle of mental health support for them to prevent long-term identity loss and psychological trauma? Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah, there's actually a whole other paper that could be written about the very rich kind of social welfare landscape that exists in Australia to support refugees who have experienced and who are actively experiencing collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, and other mental health issues. So for many of the people that I interviewed, many of them actually volunteered in organizations that were dedicated to supporting victims of trauma as a result of not just the migration process, but the integration and resettlement process and other kinds of mental health issues. And so, but one of the kind of deficiencies or gaps that many people kind of vocalized to me in the interviews, having been volunteers in these organizations, was not even around lack of cultural competence or cultural insensitivity. That really wasn't the critique. It was more that at the end of the day, no matter how much mental health counseling I get or that I participate in giving to my fellow peer as a volunteer, the structural issues, the laws and the policies are still actively working to inhibit the mobility of my loved ones, and the imperial violence and the wars that are ongoing in Afghanistan are still unfolding. And so for someone like Asman, who had a lot of experience in this space, she kind of came to that realization at a certain point that there was only so much that grief counseling and trauma counseling could do to address the structural issues that were at play. And so she actually is no longer working in that space. Now she does like climate justice activism because, I think she wanted to feel more connected to changing laws and policies, which I think a lot of Afghan Hazara people in Australia have become politicized because of these deterrence policies and laws. It is an issue of psychological violence and trauma, and it is also an issue of structural injustice and border violence. And so I think many people are thinking of it that way. But yeah, so I think both things are true at the same time. Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat. Someone is saying, thank you for your wonderful talk. My question is, were there Afghans from other ethnic backgrounds in your interview, observation, sample as well? Do you think that, especially in the post-2021 context, the ways of deterrence and the effects of deterrence would look different for Hazara migrants compared to Afghan migrants from other ethnic backgrounds, such as Pashtun, Tajik, and Uzbek?
I don't know if the law, thank you for the question. I don't know if the laws and policies would look different as it pertains to targeting migrants who take sea routes. So there were people of many other ethnic backgrounds who were affected by these laws and policies. So the people who tended to come by boat were people from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, South Sudan, Myanmar. So people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds and nationalities. And some scholars have argued, and I think I would agree with them, that the policies around preventing boat arrivals are kind of a new iteration of the White Australia policy, which was part of or a set of laws which were part of the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, which is also the period of time when Australia became a federation and an independent nation state. And so that is all to say that the policies against boat arrivals are racialized in the sense that they disproportionately affect migrants who are coming from the global south and primarily, Southwest Asia. And so would the laws and policies be different for other ethnic groups? I don't know if the laws and policies themselves would be, but perhaps the privileges of being part of an ethnic group that has had economic, political, and cultural privilege in Afghanistan, like Pashtuns, would mean that the laws might affect them in different ways. Perhaps they would have more access to social capital, economic capital that might allow them to deal with temporary status, in other ways. And so it does matter that we're talking about an ethno-racial minority that has been persecuted in Afghanistan and that continues to face racialization and discrimination amongst Pashtun Afghans in Australia as well. There have been a lot of sort of internal conflicts even in the Australian context. So I don't think I've answered the question as well as I would have liked to, but I definitely think that the ethno-racial differences matter insofar as they reflect political and social hierarchies that began in Afghanistan and how that affects people when they move to a new place. It's not exactly the same, but it does matter for sure.
All right, we'll move back to in-person questions. Question right here.
Hi, we're supposed to introduce ourselves. My name's Purna. I'm in the Department of Geography. And yeah, I thought this is like just a really lovely talk, like a lot of, feels like there's a lot of care that went into this work. So I really appreciated that. But I was wondering, like, if you can sort of, I know this is like beyond the scope of the paper, but if you can sort of like expand the vignettes a little bit to sort of tell us more about what it means to like how these three people sort of like are living now, like who is in their communities. And like you sort of started to answer this question, but like what kinds of activism are they doing? Are they all doing this? Are they all like, would they consider themselves activists? Would they consider themselves like volunteers? And like, yeah, how are like what are these communities like in a way?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so Jawed has been super active in the movement to abolish temporary protection visas and bridging visas in favor of developing a pathway to permanent protection and citizenship for refugees who came prior to 2013, that legacy caseload that I mentioned. And so his activism, I mean, it's extraordinary. Like he's been doing it since like since he arrived to mainland Australia in whatever way he could. He's been a volunteer. He now works with a global NGO who has different chapters in Australia. And so he's been really active on that front. And he's also been really active in trying to change the narrative around refugees. So one of the things that he talked about in the interview with me is like this figure of the resilient refugee and how that trope is so limiting in that it kind of, puts this demand on refugees to always exceed expectations and to always show that they can overcome any obstacle that's thrown at them. And so Jawed has kind of been working to kind of unsettle some of that discourse through his NGO work, but he's also been doing a lot of advocacy to change laws and policies in Australia, which is really risky because when he was when he was released from detention, because he was in an onshore detention center, he and many others had to sign a like non-disclosure form, which basically said that if you talk about anything that happened in detention, your bridging visa could be stripped from you. You could be, deported back to your home country. And so he was doing things that were actively putting his own legal status at risk. After being released from detention. And so he was already kind of more politically oriented, I would say. But so Ali, who is the third person whom I mentioned, he's in regional Victoria, and he started this initiative that provides humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. And so he has done a lot of collective organizing with local Afghan refugees to provide humanitarian aid. And so he does speak out from time to time around the laws and policies around deterrence, but his situation is a little bit more precarious. And so he focuses a lot on humanitarian aid. And then Osman has kind of been doing advocacy for a long time now. And she just started doing something with climate justice activism. And yeah, she has a lot of experience in the refugee, rights advocacy world. But I think she was also kind of disillusioned with that space as well, because at the end of the day, like going back to what I was talking about before, these deterrence policies seem so overwhelming to people that sometimes they don't feel like they can make a true dent within them to actually change them. And so they end up moving on to other things. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a lot of different kinds of activism and advocacy people do, which is often shaped by their current legal status and the limitations and risks that accompany that. Yeah.
Imrose?
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Zimrose. I think I really appreciated that you showed how the regime is sort of weaponizing a lot of policy and like a lot of the materials and just trying to use deterrence as like a scare tactic already in Pakistan, where some of these migrants are coming from too. And so this sort of like weaponization of policy, I feel like, because there's been a lot of migration of like Afghan and like Hazara community in Canada too. I don't know if you're picked up on some of the patterns, because you brought up the idea of slow violence and how some other countries, especially where a lot of these migrants are going to, if you picked up like how they are weaponizing their own policies too in their own ways, how Canadian environment or Canadian government is doing the similar things too, but might not look as quote unquote harsh as what Australia is doing, but they're still doing it to some point. But just wanted to say that if you have picked up on those patterns.
Thanks for your question. I haven't systematically looked at it in the Canadian context, so it's definitely something I'd like to learn more about. In Australia, there was also a case of a local somebody who was running for a local council, and he was of a Pashtun background, and he was being kind of privileged and put on a pedestal over other Hazara candidates by a variety of different, political actors. And so, yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at that in other contexts, but I haven't really done that. So if you have any recommendations for articles or anything written about it or news pieces, I'd be very happy to look at that for sure. But it is interesting to think about how these colonial logics of, pitting these different ethno-racial groups against one another play out in these new sites, in these new places where people are actively seeking safety and refuge. And then they get kind of pulled into these other sort of, conflicts of their own kind. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
I'm going to take the privilege of holding a mic to ask a question too. I was very struck by your conceptual work around the interdependence and the interdependent self, because, I think a lot of Western social science is built on the atomistic, individual, rational choice, utilitarian, person who does cost-benefit analysis, et cetera. For the people who are activists, how do they negotiate making claims on behalf of their families or their communities and highlighting the degree to which their lives are intersecting with the lives of other people back home or elsewhere against, I think, probably fears within the Australian public and or government that this is precisely what people in the global north might not want. They do not want family reunification. They don't want the entire village in Afghanistan coming to Australia, and like this fear of what people call chain migration. So it strikes me there's another violence between your experience and how you have all these ties to all these people wanting to articulate that, share that, make claims on it, but that being precisely the thing that actually might scare people as you try to make a political statement. Do they hide those ties when they're speaking publicly, or do they lean into them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for some people, advocacy spaces have actually been, interestingly, a safe space to be able to make this argument. And the reason I say that is because in Australia, like multiculturalism is such a key basis for social policy, but it also has become kind of fetishized in a way on the part of the government. And what that ends up producing is these kind of bubbles of collectives, like self-governing kind of collectives, like the state will give you money, will give you the resources, and you're kind of your own cultural bubble and your own thing. And while that has negative effects in that it essentializes people and it kind of pigeonholes their identities, and it forces them to kind of adopt these identities in order to get funding, et cetera, it also has this other side where it kind of leaves people alone to sort of do their own thing and say kind of what they want to say. And so I found, and I actually hadn't thought of it exactly like this until you asked your question, but it in a way that has allowed people to say potentially controversial, from the perspective of the state, things about policy and about the desire for family reunification in these group collective settings that are not highly monitored spaces. So I think that's really interesting. But yeah, I mean, for others who now have like permanent protection, like who have that resolution of status, there's a feeling of empowerment, a sense of like now I can really say what I want to, what I've been wanting to say, and really like take it to a whole other register in ways that I couldn't before. So yeah, I think the multiculturalism has its limitations and possibilities for activists and advocates. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. We are at the end of our time, so I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Helena Zeweri for her presentation. I would clap louder, but I'm going to make a lot of noise with this mic. Before you leave, a reminder to clean up after yourself. The containers are completely compostable, so they can go in the overflowing green bin or close to there. Don't forget to put your cans in the recycling spot. And then before you go, the Center for Migration Studies really aims to be the intellectual home for anybody and everyone who is interested in migration. We are interdisciplinary. We want to welcome everybody, irrespective of methodology, discipline, theory, background, etc. And so you are very warmly invited to our next events. And let me just give you a quick rundown of our next 3 events. Number 1, November 12th, we're going to have our CMS Sector Research Day. This is taking place off campus. It's going to be at the Falls Creek Community Center. Registration for this is live. Please go onto our website. It's going to be a full day of activities, really exciting lineup. Continuing the conversation in the morning around precarious status and focus very much in Canada and even more locally in Vancouver. So please come for that. Then we are going to have our second speaker series that's going to take place on November 24th. We're very excited to have one of our visiting scholars speak. That's going to be Ming-Shu Chen, who is a law professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And then on December 1st, we will be having our first professional development event. This is open to graduate students, but also to anyone else who would like to join. This is in the context of our Certificate for Migration Studies, and we're going to be having Lily Grewal talk about her career in migration and her current role working with the BC government. And so especially for those of you who are interested in non-academic career paths, I highly recommend that you save a spot on your calendar for Lily. She's a very engaging speaker, wealth of knowledge about governmental action and both the pros and cons of working within government when it comes to migration. And then don't forget to sign up for our weekly update, or if you're on social media, sign up for, or pay attention to our social media feeds. And then I hope to see you at our next event. Thank you very much.